Americans feel poorer now than during the Great Recession. That sounds impossible. Interest rates are coming down. Inflation has mostly cooled. The real economy is still doing decently well, even with Trump's tariffs in place. On paper, this should feel like relief. But instead, consumer pessimism is worse than it was in the late 1970s and worse than during the financial crisis. That's the contradiction. And if you felt it, that quiet sense that you're falling behind even when nothing catastrophic has happened, this story is about you. Here is the fact. By traditional measures, the economy has improved. Prices aren't spiraling, jobs still exist. Yet surveys show Americans are more dissatisfied now than in periods that were objectively harsher. That gap between reality and perception is the mystery. Now here's the implication. If the usual explanations don't fit, something else is reshaping how people judge their lives. Notice what nobody is saying out loud. What if the pressure isn't coming from your bank account, your job, or your bills, but from what you see every day on your phone? Because somewhere between scrolling and swiping, the definition of a good life may have quietly changed. And once that reference point shifts, no amount of economic improvement feels like enough. So the real question isn't why the economy feels bad. It's why it feels bad now. The core event isn't a crash, it's a disconnect. Consumer sentiment has broken away from the things that used to explain it. Inflation is mostly under control, interest rates are easing, the economy is holding together, and yet people feel worse than they did during moments when jobs were vanishing and prices were exploding. That's the surface fact. But here's the framing shift. This isn't about one bad policy, one president, or one shock. It's part of a larger pattern where material conditions and emotional reality are drifting apart. There are plenty of theories floating around. Some say people are expressing political anger through economic pessimism. Some say fear of AI job losses bleeding into everything else. Some say uncertainty itself has become the stressor. Those explanations sound plausible, but none of them explain why this dissatisfaction feels so personal, so constant, and so visual. Now here's the reframing question. What if people aren't unhappy because they're doing worse, but because they're constantly shown how much better other people appear to be doing? During the 2010s, even as happiness dropped among young people, consumer confidence stayed high. Social media existed then too, but it worked differently. You mostly saw your friends, their weddings, their vacations, their babies. It sparked envy, yes, but within a familiar range. That reference point has changed, and once it changes, the math of satisfaction changes with it. Because when your comparison group stops being people like you, something fundamental breaks. Here's the claim, stated cleanly. Social media didn't just make people compare more. It changed who they compare themselves to. That's not speculation. Research from the 2010s already showed that platforms like Facebook and Instagram increased unhappiness through social comparison. One review put it plainly. Available evidence is largely consistent with the notion that Facebook use encourages unfavorable social comparisons and envy, which may in turn lead to depressed mood. Experiments showed that even 10 minutes of scrolling could lower mood, especially for people prone to comparison. That's the fact, but here's the shift that matters. Back then, most of what people saw came from friends. Today, young people spend very little time looking at content posted by people they actually know. Instead, they're watching an algorithmic feed of strangers, and many of those strangers are influencers. People whose posts revolve around lifestyles, travel, clothes, houses, leisure. One example described is Becca Bloom, whose Instagram is filled with trips to gorgeous scenic locations and displays of expensive possessions. Another is Alex Earle, mixing dance videos with exotic vacations. This is where the story flips. These aren't movie stars or CEOs. They don't look distant or fictional. They look normal, approachable, like people you might meet at a party. but economically, they're not normal at all. Becca Bloom comes from a super rich family and sold a technology company in 2018. She's in the top 0.01%. Others sit closer to the top 1% or 5%. Their lives are out of reach for most Americans, but not obviously out of reach. Notice what's missing. Nowhere in these videos is there an explanation. No context, no balance sheet, just the lifestyle, floating free. And once that becomes the baseline, dissatisfaction stops being about what you lack and starts being about why your life doesn't look like that. This is where the escalation happens, because this kind of exposure isn't new, but the frequency and framing are. There were always rich people. In 1920, in 1920, in 1969, but most Americans almost never saw them. Maybe you read about them in a magazine. Maybe you watched a scripted TV show, and on some level you knew it wasn't real life. Today, the algorithm drops those lifestyles directly into your day. Not once, repeatedly, casually, between a cooking video and a joke. You don't have to search for it. Sometimes it just appears. And the people showing it off don't look like billionaires. They look like upper middle class professionals with great lighting, big houses, European vacations, dinner parties, things most Americans cannot afford but might feel like they should be able to. Here's the normalization. Seeing lifestyles that are statistically rare but visually common. This isn't about envy in the old sense, it's about expectation drift. When something appears often enough, the brain treats it as normal. And when your own life doesn't match that normal, dissatisfaction creeps in quietly. Here's the precedent. Americans have always been shown aspirational lives. The Brady Bunch house, the Friends apartments, ads with oversized kitchens, but those were clearly fiction. Sets, scripts, marketing, influencer content feels different. It looks like bare bones reality. Someone's actual home, their actual trip, their actual clothes. That distinction matters because fiction doesn't reset your reference point. Reality, or something that feels like it, does. And once the reference point shifts, contentment becomes harder to reach, no matter how well the economy performs. Here's the second proof hit, and it's more unsettling. The contradiction isn't just between your life and theirs. It's between how wealth used to be understood and how it now appears. Before social media, when you encountered someone richer than you usually knew why. A neighbor owned a business. A coworker got promoted. A family friend took risks and succeeded. You could explain the gap. There's research showing how much that explanation matters. One study on salary transparency found that workers paid below the median became less satisfied and more likely to job hunt, while above median earners were unaffected. Another found that people were less happy simply because their neighbors earned more, even when their own income didn't change. Relative position mattered more than absolute income. But here's the line that changes everything. Those comparisons were local and legible. Now look at influencer wealth. You see the house, the travel, the clothes, but you don't see the job, or the inheritance, or the sponsorships. Sometimes their income comes from showing the lifestyle itself. It just sits there, unanchored, a floating image of comfort and abundance, and your brain treats it the same way it would treat your sister's new car or your neighbor's renovation. This is where the words and actions diverge. Influencers don't claim to be benchmarks, but their content functions as one. Without saying it, it asks a question every viewer feels: why don't I live like that? And because there's no visible path from here to there, the answer feels personal, like failure, even when it isn't. Now the mini crisis stacks fast. First, reference points explode. Instead of comparing yourself to co-workers or neighbors with similar incomes, you're implicitly comparing yourself to people in the top 1% or 5%, sometimes even the 0.01%, whether you realize it or not. Second, explanation collapses. You're no longer seeing how money is made, just how it's spent. Some influencers have businesses, some inherited wealth, some earn money only by displaying the lifestyle itself, but none of that is visible in the feed. The wealth appears detached from effort, time, or trade-offs. Third, the comparison becomes automatic. You don't sit down and decide to measure yourself against these people. The images arrive preloaded into your day. They float past while you're tired, bored, or killing time, and your brain quietly files them under normal. This is where pressure builds, because when you can't explain the gap, you can't imagine closing it. And when you can't imagine closing it, dissatisfaction stops motivating and starts draining. Here's the escalation moment. Writers are starting to call this money dysmorphia or financial dysmorphia, a vague but persistent feeling that you're behind even if you're objectively doing fine. And then comes the data point that makes it impossible to ignore. In a recent survey, Gen Z reported that they would need to earn $588,000 a year to consider themselves financially successful. That number sits in the top 1% of individual incomes, 13 times the median personal income, more than 5 times the median family income. What happens if this reference point becomes permanent? Now shift the camera to you, not to politics, not to ideology, to daily life. Because this isn't about wanting yachts or mansions. It's about how ordinary moments start to feel quietly inadequate. You scroll while eating dinner. You see a spacious kitchen, a clean sunlit apartment, someone packing for Europe. You look back at your own space. Nothing is wrong with it, but something feels off, subtly smaller, slightly behind. That's the human impact, not rage, not despair, a low-grade dissatisfaction that hums in the background. You might be paying your bills, you might have a stable job, you might even be doing better than your parents were at your age, but the comparison isn't to your parents anymore. It's to a feed full of people who look just close enough to you that the gap feels personal. Here's the quiet damage. When success is defined visually and constantly raised, progress stops feeling like progress. Raises feel smaller, promotions feel late, stability feels like stagnation. And none of this requires you to believe influencers are bad people. The content doesn't need to be fake. It only needs to be frequent. This is why dissatisfaction spreads even without economic collapse. Because the pressure isn't coming from crisis. It's coming from contrast. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because once you notice it, you start to see how many people are carrying the same quiet weight. Here's the systemic insight that mainstream coverage misses. This isn't about jealousy. It's about how systems set reference points. Humans don't measure satisfaction in absolute terms. We measure it relative to what feels normal, attainable, and deserved. And social media rewires all three at once. The algorithm doesn't care about realism. It cares about engagement. And nothing engages like aspiration mixed with proximity. Lives that look better than yours, but not impossibly better. Close enough to trigger comparison. Distant enough to feel unreachable. That's the mechanism. Leverage without explanation. Abundance without context. Visibility without probability. Incentives matter here. Influencers are rewarded for displaying lifestyles, not balance sheets. Platforms are rewarded when users keep scrolling, not when they feel content. The system quietly benefits from dissatisfaction because dissatisfaction drives attention. This is why growth alone can't fix it. Even if incomes rise, the reference point rises faster. Redistribution can narrow gaps on paper, but it can't erase the visual hierarchy constantly reinforced on screens. Here's the unsettling part. Once a system trains people to feel behind by default, even stability feels like failure. And when that becomes widespread, consumer confidence detaches from economic reality entirely. That's not a mood problem. That's a structural one. Now look ahead, because this story doesn't end where we are. There are two paths forming, and neither is guaranteed. One path is adaptation. Over time, people may relearn that influencer lifestyles are statistical outliers, not baselines. Just like most Americans eventually understood that a giant Manhattan apartment in a 1990s sitcom wasn't real life, the spell could weaken. Fancy Europe trips and cavernous houses might start to register as rare again, not expected. Platforms might lose some of their power to define normal, but there's another path, and it's already visible. If reference points keep rising faster than incomes ever could, dissatisfaction hardens. Not into anger all at once, but into resignation. People stop feeling like effort changes outcomes. Growth feels irrelevant, stability feels pointless, and consumer confidence stays low even in good times. Here's why that matters. When people feel permanently behind, they change behavior. They delay decisions, they disengage, they stop trusting signals that used to guide economic life. This is where the next move is already forming. Not a crash, not a boom, a prolonged mismatch between how life feels and how it actually is, and that tension doesn't resolve quietly. Here's the insight that ties the entire story together. The problem isn't that Americans suddenly want too much, it's that the yardstick moved without anyone agreeing to it. An economy can improve while satisfaction collapses if people are measuring themselves against a reality that was never meant to be average. When rare lifestyles are made visible, frequent, and context-free, they stop being inspiration and start being obligation. And no policy lever can make a statistical fantasy feel attainable. This reframes everything. Consumer pessimism isn't just about prices or wages. It's about a silent redefinition of success, one driven less by economics than by exposure. And here's the loop to keep in mind. As long as feeds keep setting the benchmark, the economy will keep getting judged against something it cannot deliver, not because it failed, but because the reference point was never real to begin with. If you want to understand how power, perception, and systems quietly reshape everyday life, follow and subscribe, because the next layer of this story isn't about social media. It's about what happens when reality can't compete with the feed